If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. So he says, you're running a trade deficit. Look, they're all cheating me. But all that's happening is the United States is outspending its national income. And you can look at the national income chart. You can add up consumption and investment and government spending, and you could subtract off gross national product, and lo and behold, what will that equal? Not approximately, exactly. That will equal the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much you spend on goods and services versus how much you sell in goods and services. So the United States runs a current account deficit because it spends more than it produces. Why does it do that? We have a big credit card in the United States. It's called the national government. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says, spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No. It got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the US went up and they went down. No, everybody went down because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors. Elon Musk, who paid for his election, became prime minister. He said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt.
The safest thing in the world, apparently.
So, interesting what happened. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%
where he
on some
raised
products.
the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now, he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. Now, it raises, if I could, just one last point. How can this happen when it makes no sense? And that, people should understand, we are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing. You raise one final interesting issue, which is that the market recovered about $4 trillion when he reversed. Anyone who knew that 5 minutes before made billions. This is not the cleanest government in the world, I can tell you. I'd be hugely surprised if some people didn't know just a bit ahead of time, starting with members of the U.S. Congress, by the way. Just to say, in American politics, the swing states in the presidential elections in the last 3 elections in particular have been the Midwestern states. So those are states like Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota. These are states that can go either way. And those states did suffer a decline of employment in manufacturing, not only or even mainly because of trade, but also heavily because of automation over the last 40 years. I come from Detroit, which is Motor City, used to be, and I used to go when young on school field trips to see the assembly lines, and there were actually workers on the assembly line. But now if you go to an automotive plant, it's all robots, very, very few people inside. That's not because the jobs went overseas. In that case, that's because the assembly line itself became an automated phenomenon. So Trump is giving an answer to those swing states. It's China's fault. It's Mexico's fault. It's Lesotho's fault. What the minister said is really important, that when he said that trade benefits the economy, but it could hurt some sectors. And what you do is not stop the trade, but you make sure that you pull everyone along, maybe in a regional policy, or maybe in job reskilling, or maybe in some other kind of public investment or education policy. Here's where the U.S. really failed over the last 40 years. We let the inequalities widen and widen, partly because of automation, partly because jobs did go overseas, but for the right reason. They had comparative advantage in those jobs. Skilled people got better and better salaries. Lower skilled people had their living standards fall. The gap widened. By the way, not just the income gap, the life expectancy became 10 years or more. So many of our epidemics, so many of our social problems relate to this widening inequality. The United States political system didn't address it at all for 40 years. And that comes to what I mentioned, the corruption of the political system. When candidates of both political parties are paid by rich donors for their reelection campaigns, and both parties then become the agents of tax cuts and no really addressing the social conditions, you end up with a Donald Trump coming in and selling a pseudo explanation, it's all China, and selling a pseudo remedy, a trade war. What the auto workers are going to learn right now is they're going to lose jobs by even the tariffs that have been put in place, because we need the intermediate parts brought in from elsewhere. Now they face higher costs, and the United States can't compete at all. Trade theory or trade concept, there is the national security rationale. So you may want to procure domestically to have an armaments industry. That's quite different from imposing tariffs on 150 countries in a completely arbitrary way. In fact, the right policy might be local procurement from domestic industry that has nothing to do with trade policy at all. So that is not an argument for what he's doing. But I would add one more point. We don't need an arms race, and we don't need a war. Actually, diplomacy is really cheap compared to war. That's why we're at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, not the Antalya Military Forum. So if Trump really wanted to save some money, we have almost 800 overseas military bases in 80 countries. This is crazy. So if he wanted to save money and close the budget deficit, I would close hundreds and hundreds of military bases and leave all these countries at peace, because wherever there's an American military base, there's a big headache, believe me.